Hello, this is Corrine, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the February 4th, 2026 issue of the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. As always, thank you for joining us today. The highlights under business and finance are: Disney named Josh D'Amaro as its new chief executive, elevating the man in charge of its theme parks and cruise ships to lead the entertainment brand. U.S. manufacturing is in retreat, with fewer people working in the sector than at any point since the COVID-19 pandemic ended. Software stocks sagged on investors' fears that the technology could be supplanted by AI, helping to depress the S&P 500, NASDAQ, and Dow by 0.8%, 1.4%, and 0.3% respectively. Fed Governor Stephen Mnuchin said he has resigned from his job as a top White House economic advisor, ending an unusual dual role. Citadel founder and CEO Ken Griffin criticized the Trump administration's interference in the daily business of American companies and raised concerns about self-serving decisions made by government officials. PepsiCo is cutting prices by as much as 15% on some of its snacks after consumers complained about the affordability of the products. PayPal replaced its chief executive, saying its board decided the pace of change and execution was not in line with expectations. Google plans to spend $4.75 billion to help find enough electricity to run more data centers, a capacity essential to maintaining the AI race. Nintendo maintained its annual forecast for Switch 2 sales and net profit, even as it reported sharply higher 9-month results, boosted by the gaming device's popularity. Now for the key articles under the Worldwide section. The Republican-led House passed funding legislation to end a partial government shutdown and kicked off 10 days of negotiations over immigration enforcement. 2 Iranian maritime provocations against the U.S. appear not to have derailed scheduled nuclear talks between Tehran and Washington this week, U.S. officials said. A new poll shows 76% of Greenlanders say they wouldn't benefit from becoming part of the U.S., noting disparities in provisions for social welfare between Denmark and the U.S. Trump doubled down on his view that Republicans should nationalize voting in the U.S., questioning whether certain states should continue running their own elections as spelled out in the Constitution. Former President Bill Clinton and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton reached a deal to appear for depositions in the House investigation into Jeffrey Epstein. Trump said he is seeking $1 billion in damages from Harvard University, the latest escalation in his administration's fight with the institution over alleged anti-Semitism. Polish authorities arrested a defense ministry official for allegedly spying on behalf of Russia and Belarus in one of the country's highest profile espionage cases. A Doberman pinscher named Penny won Best in Show at the 150th Annual Westminster Kennel Club Dog Show in New York City. The picture on today's front page shows men and women outside setting up what appears to be a soup kitchen, where the cauldrons are boiling and tables full of bread are visible. The picture on today's front page takes place outside, where men and women are ladling soups from a huge cauldron that is bubbling into dishes, and on the table are loaves of bread, and a truck is backed up with additional supplies, and it looks like an outdoors soup kitchen. The caption reads, "Warm Hearts." Polish volunteers served soup in a bitterly cold Kyiv on Tuesday as Russia launched one of its biggest strikes on Ukrainian cities. The air attack hit thermal power plants and left nearly 2,000 apartment buildings without heat. And that headline reads, "Russia resumes attacks to cripple Ukraine energy." Russia resumes strikes on Ukrainian energy sites. By Anastasia Malenko. Russia launched its biggest aerial assault of the year on Ukraine, ending a pause on strikes on Ukraine's energy systems and dealing another blow to the country during some of the winter's coldest days. President Trump said he asked Russian President Vladimir Putin to hold off on strikes for a week because of the frigid temperatures. Russia continued its nightly barrages on Ukraine, including strikes on transportation infrastructure, but Moscow appeared to refrain for several days from direct assaults on energy. That ended on Tuesday. Russian forces attacked 8 Ukrainian regions, striking thermal power plants providing heat for residents of the capital of Kyiv and other cities such as Kharkiv and Dnipro, the Energy Ministry said. The attack left nearly 2,000 apartment buildings without heat in Kyiv and Kharkiv, with the temperatures dropping to 13 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. The strikes, which injured at least 12 people, left authorities in several cities scrambling to drain water from radiators in some buildings to prevent damage to heating systems. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Kyiv would continue to support de-escalatory steps ahead of talks between the U.S., Russia, and Ukraine, which are set to resume on Wednesday in Abu Dhabi. The strikes on Tuesday, he said, were an indication of Moscow's unwillingness to engage in the peace process. Each such Russian strike confirms that attitudes in Moscow have not changed. They continue to bet on war and the destruction of Ukraine, and they do not take diplomacy seriously, Zelensky wrote on X, urging the timely delivery of air defense missiles from allies. Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican from South Carolina, one of Ukraine's supporters in Congress, urged Trump to put more pressure on Russia following Tuesday's attack. After this massive attack last night, I would urge President Trump to start a process to provide Ukraine with Tomahawk missiles, which would be a game changer militarily. In the coming days and weeks, we must apply more pressure to Putin, Graham said in a post on X. U.S. manufacturing is in retreat. Factories cut jobs as President's promised boom from tariffs hasn't occurred. By David Uberti. The manufacturing boom President Trump promised would usher in a golden age for the U.S. is going in reverse. After years of economic interventions by the Trump and Biden administrations, fewer people work in manufacturing than any point since the pandemic ended. Manufacturers shed workers in each of the 8 months after Trump unveiled Liberation Day tariffs, according to federal figures, extending a contraction that has seen more than 200,000 roles disappear since 2023. An index of factory activity tracked by the Institute for Supply Management shrunk in 26 straight months through December, but showed a January uptick in new orders and production that surprised analysts. The Census Bureau estimated that manufacturing construction spending, which surged with Biden-era funding for chips and renewable energy, fell in each of Trump's first 9 months in office. The gradual slowdown is, in some ways, a continuation of decades-long trends that pulled factory jobs overseas and helped empty out Midwestern cities. In an industry where capital plans and construction timelines extend years into the future, turnarounds also don't happen overnight. In November, the Federal Reserve slashed estimates for overall U.S. output since the pandemic in an annual revision to metrics for industrial production. We never got all the way back from the pandemic, said Josh Lehner, a U.S. economist at SGH Macro Advisors. The biggest factor overall is how manufacturing is doing, is how our economy is doing. There's no getting away from that, said Scott Paul, president of the Alliance for American Manufacturing, which supports tariffs on steel and many Chinese products. It's way too early to tell what the new normal is because we've just exited the roller coaster ride. Disney names its parks chief as new CEO. Damaro tapped to be 9th person to lead the company in its 102-year history. By Ben Fritz. Disney named Josh Damaro as its new chief executive officer, putting the man in charge of the theme parks and cruise ships, which have become its biggest source of profits, atop the U.S.'s best-known entertainment brand. Damaro has been tapped to succeed Bob Iger to become the 9th leader of Disney in its 102-year history. The job requires not only running a sprawling empire, but also serving as its high-profile and highly scrutinized public ambassador. Damaro won a challenging competition for the job against Disney's entertainment co-chairman Dana Walden that has been the talk of Hollywood for more than a year. Walden was named to the newly created position of President and Chief Creative Officer. Disney's leadership was determined to run this succession process as smoothly as possible after its disastrous last try. The company named previous Parks boss Bob Chapek as CEO in 2020, only to fire him and bring back Iger 2 years later. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The aide stoking Trump's impulses. Stephen Miller uses his White House clout to fuel boundary-pushing policies. By Josh Dawsey and Tarina Party. Moments after federal officers fatally shot Alex Preddy, his body still lying face down on an icy Minneapolis street, Customs and Border Protection officers texted Stephen Miller, the White House aide and presidential confidant who framed the government's response. While White House communication and policy aides tried to sort out what they knew, what they should say, and who would brief President Trump, Miller jumped ahead. 3 hours after the shooting, Miller told the world via X that the slain VA nurse was a domestic terrorist who had tried to assassinate federal law enforcement, a description that set off one of the Trump administration's biggest political crises of the president's second term. None of the language Miller used had been approved or reviewed, said administration officials familiar with the matter. Miller, who shared a photo of the handgun found on Preddy's hip with White House officials, told colleagues his comments were based on early information. Not long after Miller's tweet, Trump posted the photo of the gun on his own social media post, saying the weapon was loaded and ready to go. "What is that all about?" Trump wrote. Video footage soon contradicted Miller's portrayal of Preddy and marked a rare setback for the singularly powerful White House advisor who has shaped many of the president's most incendiary impulses. Miller has been an architect in almost every boundary-pushing effort in Trump's second term, according to White House officials familiar with the matter, including immigration sweeps in U.S. cities and the deadly boat strikes in the Caribbean. Miller, a 40-year-old from historically progressive Santa Monica, California, has been by Trump's side through thick and thin since 2016, earning the president's trust in part by proving that an aggressive approach to curbing illegal immigration would be a political winner. Miller has repeatedly said that bad people have poured into the U.S. and the administration should respond with aggressive enforcement. He confronts aides who bring up legal checks that might hinder his pursuit and dismisses concerns over public reaction to the administration's most far-reaching measures, White House officials said. The administration's immigration push is split between the sweeping measures in line with Miller's view and the belief of Tom Homan, Trump's border czar, and Todd Lyons, the ICE director, that agents should target immigrants with criminal histories or final deportation orders. Miller is known for working longer hours than most anyone at the White House. His office is on the second floor of the West Wing, but he usually floats around the first floor, including the Oval Office. Unlike most of his colleagues, Miller has Secret Service protection. Early in Trump's second term, Miller amassed power in his own Homeland Security Council and outfoxed others with his command of the workings of government, according to White House advisors. His authority, officials said, derives from his ability to manage the president. AI worry erases $300 billion in software firms' market value, by Matt Wirtz and Jack Pitcher. Investors' fears that new developments in artificial intelligence will supplant software reverberated through the stock market Tuesday, dragging down the shares of companies that develop, license, and even invest in code and systems. Traders have questioned whether AI will chip away at the competitive moat built by software makers like Adobe and Salesforce, ever since generative AI models hit the market several years ago. Recent advancements in tools, such as those from AI developer Anthropic, are now prompting more scrutiny. On Tuesday morning, investors honed in on Anthropic's announcement that it was adding new legal tools to its co-work assistant meant to help automate a number of legal drafting and research tasks. Shares of Thomson Reuters, LegalZoom.com, and London Stock Exchange, which all provide some form of legal tools or research databases, all fell more than 12%. By afternoon trading, the downturn had swept through the broader software market. A pair of S&P indexes that track software, financial data, and exchange stocks lost a combined total of around $300 billion in market value. The tech-heavy NASDAQ composite fell 1.4%. The S&P 500 was 0.8% lower, while the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which is less exposed to software, shed around 167 points, or 0.3%. The selling Tuesday wasn't particularly widespread. 5 of the S&P 500's 11 sectors closed higher. PayPal, Expedia, EPAM Systems, Equifax, and Intuit were among the hardest hit, all also dropping more than 10%. Walmart joins the $1 trillion club. In trading Tuesday morning, Walmart passed the $125.47 a share needed to reach its trillion-dollar valuation. Shares closed up 2.9%, giving the retailer a market cap of $1.018 trillion. There's a chart showing companies with a market value over $1 trillion. And at the top is NVIDIA with $4 trillion, and at the bottom, Walmart. The others are Alphabet, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, Tesla, Broadcom, Berkshire Hathaway, and then, of course, Walmart. President signs measure to end shutdown. Funding legislation kicks off 10 days of talks over enforcing immigration laws, by Olivia Beavers and Siobhan Hughes, Washington. The Republican-led House narrowly passed funding legislation to end a partial government shutdown and kick off 10 days of negotiations over immigration enforcement after President Trump helped stamp out an intra-party rebellion. The House voted 217 to 214 to fund a large portion of the government through the rest of the fiscal year, which ends September 30th. The Senate cleared the package last week. Trump, who repeatedly urged lawmakers to back the deal, signed it into law, restoring funding for agencies that had lapsed Saturday. The legislation provides $1.2 trillion spread across 5 spending bills, including the Pentagon and the Health and Human Services departments. It splits off a 6th measure for the Department of Homeland Security, instead funding it through February 13th at current levels. DHS was separated to allow lawmakers more time to negotiate over possible new restrictions on immigration agents demanded by Democrats. Iran moves not seen, derailing talks. Gunboats tried to stop a tanker, and a drone flew close to a U.S. aircraft carrier. By Lara Sigelman, Benoit Falcon, and Jared Malzin. For a few hours on Tuesday, 2 Iranian provocations against the U.S. raised questions as to whether nuclear talks between Tehran and Washington could be derailed. But negotiations are still expected this week, U.S. officials said, keeping diplomacy on the table, even as President Trump amasses a large military force and issues repeated threats against Iran. The U.S. shot down an Iranian drone aimed at the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln, and a U.S. flagship outran an attempt by an armed Iranian gunboats to force it to stop, spiking tensions in the Persian Gulf. But back in Washington, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt told reporters that U.S.-Iran talks are still scheduled. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner had been scheduled to attend a meeting with Iranians on Friday in Turkey, people familiar with the matter said. Trump, also speaking about Iran, added, "They are negotiating. They'd like to do something, and we'll see if something is going to be done." From the U.S. Watch section. NASA moon trip delayed again. NASA's long-awaited moonshot with astronauts is off until at least March because of hydrogen fuel leaks that marred the dress rehearsal of its giant new rocket. It is the same problem that delayed the Space Launch System's rocket debut 3 years ago. That first test flight was grounded for months because of leaking hydrogen. Officials said the month-long delay will allow the launch team to conduct another fueling test before committing the 4 astronauts, 3 U.S. and 1 Canadian, to a lunar fly-around. New York. Legal observers to monitor ICE actions. New York's Attorney General announced plans Tuesday to deploy legal observers to monitor federal immigration enforcement actions in the state. The initiative will send observers who will wear purple safety vests to areas of reported immigration enforcement activity to collect information that may inform future legal action, Attorney General Letitia James said. Tensions remain high nationwide over President Trump's aggressive immigration crackdown, particularly following the shooting deaths of 2 U.S. citizens at the hands of federal agents in Minnesota. Videos. We have seen in Minnesota how quickly and tragically federal operations can escalate in the absence of transparency and accountability, James said. James said her office's observers will serve as neutral witnesses who will identify violations of law, but won't interfere with enforcement activity. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. From the editorial page, Vladimir Putin isn't winning in Ukraine. The Russian death toll may be as high as 325,000 in 4 years. President Trump has his hands full in Venezuela, while also pondering military action in Iran, but the Ukraine war is grinding on, and Vladimir Putin wants the world to think he can't be defeated. A new, detailed report on the war underscores that Mr. Putin isn't winning, and Mr. Trump can still apply military and economic pressure to produce a peace that is honorable. Russian forces have taken an astonishing 1.2 million casualties in Ukraine since 2022, according to estimates from Seth Jones and Riley McCabe of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. The Russian death toll may be as high as 325,000, more than 5 times than in any Soviet and Russian conflicts combined since World War II. Some 36,000 Americans died in the grinding 3-year Korean War. The conventional wisdom is that Mr. Putin will eventually prevail because Russia is the larger power, and Mr. Putin can keep throwing men into his human meat grinder. Yet Mr. Putin isn't making territorial gains commensurate with his losses. Consider Mr. Putin's struggle to take the city of Pokrovsk. Russian forces have advanced in the area on average 70 meters a day from late February 2024 to January of this year. That's like starting the day on 42nd Street in Manhattan and ending up on 43rd Street. The Ukraine war draws comparisons to the trench warfare of World War I, but the Russian advance has been slower than the most brutal offensive campaigns over the last century, including the notoriously bloody Battle of the Somme during World War I, says the report. Ukraine has its own manpower shortages, but Russian casualties are 2 or 2.5 to 1 for Ukraine. Meanwhile, half of Moscow's budget is flowing to the armed forces, the military-industrial complex, domestic security, and debt services, CSIS notes. Moscow doesn't have the economic growth or dynamism to keep underwriting the misadventure for the long haul. One illustrative fact: Russia has a grand total of 0 companies in the top 100 list of technology companies as measured by market capitalization. All of this means Mr. Putin shouldn't be able to wield a whip hand at the negotiating table. The Russian dictator is in a weakened position that Mr. Trump could exploit with tougher sanctions and more U.S. weapons to at least force Mr. Putin to give up some stolen territory and tolerate real security guarantees. The same Mr. Trump who arms his diplomacy with Iran to increase his leverage has been oddly unwilling to do the same with Mr. Putin. But a weak peace would let Mr. Putin up off the mat, as GOP Senate Armed Services Committee Chairman Roger Wicker put it last year. the Russian would rearm with a renewed animus for NATO. Mr. Putin isn't the unstoppable man he wants Mr. Trump to think he is. The question of the past year has been whether President Trump will see this strategic opening to reduce the Russian threat to the U.S. and deter the world's bad actors in Beijing and elsewhere by driving a harder bargain in Ukraine. From the opinion pages, Trump's ICE tactics alienate Americans. The hardcore mega base supports him, but that won't be enough to win the midterms. By William A. Galston. During the first year of his second term, President Trump has governed as if he needs to please only one subset of those who voted for him in 2024, his hardcore mega base. This is a mistake. Only 6 in 10 Republicans identify as mega supporters, while about 3 in 10 say they aren't, and the rest are unsure, according to a recent Economist YouGov poll. Only 54% of all Americans who voted for Mr. Trump identify with MAGA. Polling last summer found that while 55% of Americans liked Mr. Trump's deportation goals, only 44% liked the means he was using to achieve those goals, and that support for immigration and customs enforcement was declining. Many of the president's supporters have come to share these reservations. More than a third of those who voted for him in 2024 now say in a Politico poll that while they back the goals of his mass deportation campaign, they disapprove of the way he's implementing it. This sentiment is especially prevalent among non-MAGA supporters. Overall, 62% of MAGA Trump voters and only 37% of non-MAGA Trump voters support Mr. Trump's deportation goals and methods. That Mr. Trump is governed with an eye only to his base helps explain the steady erosion of support since the early weeks of his administration. The recent violent confrontations in Minneapolis have generated a crisis that threatens to engulf his agenda and wipe out the Republican majority in the House. Nearly everyone agrees that immigrants illegally in the U.S. who have committed serious crimes should be deported. But self-identifying MAGA voters are out of step with the broader public. Of those polled by Politico, 44% of MAGA Trump voters say that the federal government should aim to deport as many illegal immigrants as possible, regardless of criminal history. Only 18% of all voters take this stance. Less than a third of voters think that people who arrived here illegally as children should be deported, according to a Harvard-Harris poll. Putting a 5-year-old in a detention center generates images that no public relations expert can spin away. The distinction between permitted and forbidden means is the core of the rule of law. Most Americans understand this instinctively and reject government actions that violate their sense of what law and common decency permit. The actions of ICE and Border Patrol agents have crossed this line. According to Harvard-Harris, majorities believe that federal agents have gone too far and are violating civil liberties. In the fatal shootings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, they say agents were too quick to use excessive force. A plurality believe that agents should be making targeted arrests, not engaging in random street sweeps. Most Americans think agents shouldn't make arrests in workplaces, schools, or daycare centers. By wide margins, according to Pew Research Center, they think it's unacceptable for agents to use people's appearance or the language they speak as a reason to check their immigration status. They also reject agents' use of face coverings to hide their identities. According to multiple recent surveys, Americans now believe that ICE actions have been more harmful than beneficial and have made American cities less safe. They want the federal government to change course. Agents shouldn't enter private homes without warrants or detain U.S. citizens, most Americans say. They shouldn't wear plain clothes but uniforms that identify their agency. They should be required to identify themselves and to wear body cameras. Funding for ICE is now less popular than foreign aid, and 51% of Americans believe that the federal government should decrease funding for ICE a lot or slightly, according to a YouGov poll. This is a remarkable state of affairs for an agency whose goals enjoy broad public support. The fight over the 2026 budget for the Department of Homeland Security gives the Trump administration and congressional Republicans an opportunity to change course. But they face a conundrum familiar to veterans of electoral politics: to placate the frustrated voters who threaten to jump ship, they'll need to take steps that could antagonize Mr. Trump's most fervent supporters. Persuading the mega base that it's necessary to moderate the push for mass deportations won't be easy. Immigration is the issue about which many of them care the most. If the administration looks as if it's pulling back, some of them could stay home in November. Still, Mr. Trump has little choice, as he seems to realize. A new Fox News survey finds that 68% of Americans, including 48% of Republicans, believe that the president isn't devoting enough time to the country's economic problems. Mr. Trump's recent effort to pivot to the economy has no chance of breaking through as long as the controversy over deportations dominates the news. 7 in 10 Americans rate economic conditions as fair or poor. If they think that Mr. Trump isn't focused on improving the economy, it's hard to see how his party can avoid a serious setback in the midterm elections. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Now from the opinion pages. Trump hands Democrats a golden opportunity. Voters reconsider the Faustian bargain they struck in voting for the president in 2024. By Rahm Emanuel. The GOP is in trouble, as polls and pundits have made abundantly clear. President Trump is underwater, so much so that even Joe Rogan is comparing the deployment of immigration and customs enforcement to the Gestapo. 10 months ahead of an election destined to be a referendum on the incumbent party, the generic Democrat leads the generic Republican by 4 to 5 points, according to a January New York Times Siena poll. That said, nuances in the public's collective psychology matter for how or whether various voters show up to the polls. 3 slices of American voters are having 3 distinct reactions to the president's first year in office. First, Democratic voters are angry at what the president is doing, and they're even angrier that he's seemingly getting away with it. We saw Mr. Trump for what he was during his first term, and we told the public what he was going to do during the second go-around. Yet much of the country ignored the warning signs. Now that the mask has come off, the personal enrichment, the ICE-induced chaos in Minnesota and Oregon, the pardons for January 6 criminals, and the alienation of the traditional Democratic allies overseas. Many Democrats are rightfully indignant, but the intensity of our rage can easily come across as self-righteous. When indignation morphs into a tone of "I told you so," it will be flipped against us. The second, most surprising reaction is among the MAGA faithful. Like many others, I presumed a few months ago that we were entering a post-Trump era. But when I listened to former Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene argue that Mr. Trump is abandoning his America First credo, I realized that she and other disaffected Republicans are feeling not only untethered, but betrayed. Mr. Trump promised to drain the swamp. Instead, he's dug it wider and deeper. He claimed he would boost working-class incomes, but he has instead worked tirelessly to enhance his own family's wealth. He claimed he would end foreign wars, but he has attacked Venezuela, Nigeria, and Iran, and he has threatened Greenland. The third shift for Democrats' fortunes is among the voters who broke for Mr. Trump in 2024, despite all the things they found distasteful about him personally. Among these voters, who represent the largest slice of the electorate, according to Gallup, a record high 45% today, the overwhelming sentiment is discomfort and disquiet. In a Faustian bargain, they overlooked his abhorrent personality because they believed his business acumen would fix the economy, that he wouldn't get distracted by social and cultural issues. That was the subtext of the famous tagline, "Kamala is for they, them. President Trump is for you." But he hasn't come through. The economy is still leaving too many people behind. Too many young people are still stuck in their parents' basements because their paychecks don't cover their monthly bills. These voters feel as though they've gotten the short end of the bargain. Worst of all, no one is rising up to stand in Mr. Trump's way. No institution, not his staff, not the Supreme Court, and certainly not Congress, is rising up to check Mr. Trump's bad judgment, instincts, and character. The president appears entirely unencumbered and unhinged. Politically, this third group is most important, not only because they will decide who wins in November, but because independents have grown to encompass nearly half of the electorate and will be an essential part of any durable Democratic majority going forward. The Hispanic voters who swung to Mr. Trump in 2024 are more open than most voters to switching their party allegiance. But becoming anti-Trump doesn't automatically make them Democrats, and that's a key distinction. All of which is to suggest that Democrats need, in the short term, to lean heavily into the notion that Republican members of Congress are acting as the president's enablers. If voters aren't sick of hearing the phrase "rubber stamp GOP Congress," The day after the November election, our messaging will have failed in service of its strategic objective. Which brings us to the long-term future. To cement the support of these unaffiliated voters, Democrats will have to avoid the mistake we so often make of telling people we were right all along. Smug superiority is the electoral kryptonite that gets us every time. But the road to sustained political success is filled with other messaging traps as well. Recall that defund the police was an electoral disaster. So was the offer of free health care at the border for undocumented immigrants in 2020. Today, we risk losing sight of these same voters as activists try to rally around calls to abolish ICE. Far from abandoning enforcement in the wake of Renee Good and Alex Preddy's killings, we need fundamental reforms that strengthen oversight, ensure due process, and deepen trust between law enforcement at every level and the local communities they serve. Despite what the party's small dollar donor class may want, that doesn't mean that voters are suddenly of a different mind about the effects of illegal immigration at the border, public safety, incomes for working families, or how people with fancy degrees from fancy colleges want to tell them how to live their lives for the better. We need to be focused on embracing policies that appeal not to our base alone, but to the swing voters who now represent nearly half the electorate and will determine our electoral success. We need to adopt a tone that draws those same voters into a more permanent part of our governing coalition. For the past quarter century, elections in this country have gone from post to post, with voters throwing one set of bums out for the next. Democrats have an opportunity to end that cycle, building for themselves the sort of approach that would win not only in 2026, but also serve as a building block for 2028, much as 2006 presaged 2008. The next 10 months will be about branding Republicans in Congress as Mr. Trump's enablers. Beyond that, we need to focus on speaking to the interests and sensibilities of those who considered or took the Faustian bargain Mr. Trump offered them last year and are uncomfortable today with all the chaos they got in return for little economic benefit. Mr. Emanuel, a Democrat, served as a U.S. representative from Illinois, 2003 to 9. White House Chief of Staff, 2009 to 10. Mayor of Chicago, 2011 to 19. And Ambassador to Japan, 2022 to 25. Letter to the editor. Who'll go get Venezuela oil? Peter McPherson's proposal to stabilize Venezuela via an oil dividend is a compelling application of the Alaska model. But it raises a fundamental question of capital flow. In a nation with a hollowed-out energy infrastructure, whose money is actually reaching the people? To restore Venezuela's production from its current state, international oil companies must commit tens of billions in capital. These firms will rightly demand cost recovery and profit margins before a single barrel is cleared for a sovereign fund. If the proposed dividend is pulled from the top-line revenue, it risks deterring the very private investment required to make the wells pump again. Conversely, if it is pulled from the bottom line, after the companies and the new government take their cut, the dividend for the average Venezuelan may be too negligible to spark the economic rebuilding Mr. McPherson envisions. The Trump administration's current use of a Qatar-based trust fund to shield assets from creditors is a necessary first step. But for this to work, the administration must provide a transparent framework that balances a win-win for both the foreign investor and the local citizen. Without clear rules on who gets paid first, we risk repeating the mistakes of Iraq, where the promise of shared wealth was buried under the weight of reconstruction cost and lack of transparency. From Mark Giannani, Rochester, New York. The Pepper and Salt cartoon shows what appears to be a psychologist sitting at a chair and a young boy who looks very much like Pinocchio with a very long nose is reclining on a couch. And he says, "Lawyer is a pejorative term. I prefer to think of myself as a fabulist." The interest rates today compared to last week. A 5-year CD is the same, 1.68%. 30-year fixed mortgage was 6.25%, now 6.22%. A 15-year mortgage was 5.67%, now 5.90%. A jumbo mortgage was 6.41%, now 6.40%. A 5-year adjustable mortgage was 5.79%, now 5.82%. A new car loan was 6.86%, now 6.91%. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the February 4th, 2026 issue of the Wall Street Journal. We read from the Wall Street Journal every Monday through Thursday at 11 p.m. Your reader has been Corrine. Thank you for listening, and stay warm.